Chapter 106. I Win 3. He was Zorian Kaczynski, the third son of a minor merchant family from Siren, accidental time traveler, and quite possibly the most powerful human mind mage in all of Altazia. And he had won. It was not an easy task to arrange all of this. Sure, he could have beaten Jornak in Silver Lake, stopped the ritual and left it at that. But that would be a very bittersweet outcome. Zack would have died at the end of the month and Zorian would have spent the rest of his future running away from Eldamarian assassins and whatnot. Zorian did not spend all those years in the time loop just to settle for a suboptimal outcome. The first task, of course, was figuring out how to get past the mind blank spell. Even before he had known about Zack's angelic contract, he'd known the boy was hiding something of critical importance that he would have to wrench out of his head. Thus he worked with Svim, Arania and many others to find the solution. A way to beat the ultimate mental defense. A spell that had been providing total protection against mind magic, no exceptions, for literal centuries now. A lot of people Zorian had worked with thought it was a fool's task to begin with. What did Zorian have that so many other mind mages that tried to invent a workaround hadn't? But Zorian didn't embark upon this idea blindly. He already had an idea before he threw himself into the project. The Soul Sizer Chrysanthemum was a very rare and obscure magical creature. It was so dangerous and frightening to people that they had long since eradicated it in more civilized areas, not even bothering to study it properly before doing so. Who was brave enough to research a flower that would eat your soul if you made a mistake in restraining it? Not many people. It didn't help that the plant was a very valuable component for many potions, meaning it was worth more dead than alive to begin with. In modern times, of course, some mage or organization would have probably become interested in the Soul Sizer and organized a hunt so its abilities could be studied. Except that the plant only lived in monster-infested wilderness these days, was surprisingly good at hiding, and smart enough to pick its fights carefully. Plus, its abilities were not well known, and old descriptions found in ancient tomes did not do the creature justice. They made the chrysanthemum look like a simple plant-shaped soul eater. It just wasn't that impressive sounding. Zorian had experienced the flower's attack firsthand, however. Zack hadn't thought much about their experience, seeing it only as an embarrassing instance where they had nearly been beaten by a flower and soon forgot about it. But Zorian had never forgotten. The way the plant's initial stunning attack had simply bypassed all of their defenses left a deep impression on him. If the chrysanthemum could bypass their defenses by targeting their body, mind, and soul simultaneously, could the same method be used to target someone's mind even when it was protected by the mind blank? Mind blank protected the mind by separating it from what the Arania called the Great Web. The mind closed in on itself, rejecting all contact. But it was still connected to the brain and to the soul. It should be possible to target the mind by going through those two somehow. This wasn't a new idea by any means, but most people who tried to make such a method work before hadn't had the Soul Sizer Chrysanthemum on hand to provide a working example of how such a thing would work in practice. Zorian did. And he had a whole host of experts in both soul magic and mind magic to help him figure it out. The process of studying the chrysanthemum's abilities had some unintended benefits. He probably would not have found a way to negate the wraith bombs in a reasonable amount of time if he hadn't spent so much time studying the flower and its abilities. And he wouldn't have been able to make the weapon that Merva had used to disable Quata Kickle for a few moments. These were all just side benefits, however, paling in importance to the real end goal of the research. The Manifold Resonance spell. The spell was not ideal by any means. First of all, the magic Zorian and his team designed could only be used through touch. Skin-to-skin contact was required to successfully cast the spell. It was also incredibly complicated and hard to control. 3 whole minds were needed to execute the spell. Not an impossible requirement for someone who could make simulacrums like Zorian could, but still an issue. Finally, targets eventually acquired a resistance to it. Experiments showed that targeting the same person repeatedly with the spell made them instinctively resist it after only a handful of attempts. In the case of people with highly trained defenses like Svim and Alanik, that meant they became resistant after only 2 or 3 attempts. But it worked. It was complicated and inconvenient, but it did the impossible, and that was all that mattered. With the spell to bypass mind blank in his arsenal, actual victory, was finally possible. In the end, that path had led him here, locked in a deadly battle against his fellow time travelers, Zack and Jornak. When Zorian teleported next to the 2 combatants and lunged at them, hands glowing, he knew neither would take it lying down. Zack looked shocked at his sudden betrayal, but he was an experienced fighter and reacted immediately, firing a pair of blindingly bright white rays that nearly took Zorian's head off. Only his defense cube saved him by warping space around him slightly to make the beams miss. As for Jornak, he drew the Imperial dagger out of his belt with a smooth, practiced motion and thrust it straight at Zorian's face. Zorian didn't know much about the Imperial dagger. Its main ability out of the time loop was supposed to be its ability to hurt spirits, but why take that chance? He doubted Jornak would try to use it on him if it wasn't uniquely useful in this situation. He jumped back a little, evading the stab at the cost of losing some momentum and giving up some of his advantage of surprise. "Zorian, what dash?" Zack started saying, outrage evident in his voice that he never got to finish it. A marble Zorian accidentally dropped out of his pocket before he jumped back, suddenly activated and instantly sucked in all the air around them, creating a sizable area of total vacuum between them. The surrounding air quickly rushed in to fill the void, forcefully dragging all three of them into the center of the area. Jornak and Zack were unharmed but caught off guard. But Zorian was ready. The moment they collided with each other, he clamped down on Zack and Jornak's hands and cast the spell. A faint blue wave quickly rippled through them, expanding from the point of contact to envelop their whole bodies. They still had their mind blank spells on, but it didn't matter. Their bodies went limp, insensate to the world around them. A moment later, they were plunged into a constructed dream world over which Zorian had total control. It was an incredible achievement creating this thing, and this wasn't just Zorian praising himself. The Arania were also in awe of the scale of what he created. That said, he wasn't doing this alone. Aside from him and his simulacrums, many Arania were helping him control the illusionary world. On top of that, he wasn't really conjuring people's surroundings out of nothing. He was accessing eyes of people around the city and his iron beaks in the sky to give Zack and Jornak as convincing of an experience as he possibly could. He had to mess with their memories slightly, mostly to make it look like they won in a convincing manner. A process that took some trial and error, since Zorian didn't have a perfect understanding of their capabilities and habits. Thankfully, any mistake could be covered up by simply wiping away their short-term memories and letting them relive the battle again and again until he got it right. He also had to adjust Zack's perception of what happened to Quetzalcoatl, since his contract couldn't be fulfilled unless the Lich was seemingly dead. He made it look like his chrysanthemum weapon actually managed to suck out Quetzalcoatl's soul and kill him for good, which Zack thankfully accepted as actually possible. Zorian took it as a compliment that Zack had that much faith in his artifice. Then there was the matter of Zack going around reading people's minds. Zorian had known that Zack would try that. After all, how else was he going to confirm that people did not know anything about the time loop? Unfortunately, the boy was right that Zorian couldn't really create convincing fake minds. Even the dumbest, most boring person in existence had a mind more complex and intricate than anything Zorian could conjure purely from his own imagination. So he didn't even try. Through his network of sigils around the city, Zorian was potentially connected to every person who was still alive there. He could act as a mental bridge, allowing Zack to connect to any person in the city through him. The minds he was reading were very much real. Sadly, that also meant that when Zack checked people's minds and saw they didn't remember anything that had happened during this past month, this was in no way faked. They really didn't remember anything. Zorian was forced to strip them of their mind blanks through dispelling, and wipe away their memories of the month. He had thought about being more selective about it, but he wanted things to be absolutely convincing to whatever evaluation mechanics Zack's angel contract employed. He had gifted people like Svim, Alanik and Diamond memory crystals containing their deleted memories for later perusal, but he knew that wasn't nearly the same as having their real memories. They weren't trained psychics like he was, so digesting their memories from such a source would be a struggle. As for the Arania, deleting their memories of the whole month was kind of tricky since they were helping Zorian run this whole illusion and he needed their help right now. Obviously, them not having any memories of all this would be a bit of a problem. Thus, only the Arania that Zack actually deigned to talk to deleted their memories, and Zack was never overly fond of the giant spiders. Thus, the damage to the integrity of the illusion was minimal in the end. Even better, Zorian didn't have to provide the Arania with anything to make them recover after this. They had their own well-developed system of storing their memories and had lots of practice of integrating stored memories into their minds later, so it shouldn't be a big chore for them to recover quickly. Zorian was never as thankful for Zack's disinterest in learning about Iranian society as he was at this moment. If Zack had known anything about them, he would have known that the only reliable way to make sure they forgot something was to murder them all. Which, admittedly, wouldn't have been that hard to fake, but still. Zorian suspected the Arania would have forever borne a grudge against the boy if they had all collectively been butchered by the guy they were trying to save, even if it was understandable in their current circumstances, and done entirely in pretend fashion. As for Jornak, the main reason he was trapped in his own private illusion was because Zorian wanted to find all the dead man switches the guy had scattered all over the place. He knew Jornak would make them suffer from beyond the grave if they just let him die. He needed to find out what he had in store for them and how to disarm his traps and contingencies. He tried to simply get their fellow time traveler to simply talk about his plans. It was a good thing he did. He had done a basic search of his memories, of course, but searching someone's memories for information depended on knowing what to look for, and Zorian knew that Jornak was a lot more devious and experienced in this kind of cloak and dagger bullshit than he was. It only took a few conversations with Jornak in various guises to understand that he would have missed many things if he simply tried lifting things out of his mind. However, even this wasn't enough. Jornak had no real friends. His closest emotional attachment was to the damn Imperial dagger, of all things. Thus, he was understandably cagey around other people, even when Zorian prodded him with subtle suggestions and emotional manipulation to make him more talkative. Eventually, Zorian resorted to messing with Jornak's perception of time, making him believe days or weeks had passed in order to learn what he would have done, and what he expected to happen. Meanwhile, the invasion of the city was being beaten back all over the city. All of the invasion leaders except the upper echelons of the cult of the World Dragon were gone now, and they were unable to rally the disparate forces around their leadership. Eventually, the higher echelons of the Ibasan forces found out that Quatakikal was no longer present on the battlefield, and sounded a retreat. Ayaska Mansion was mostly demolished, but Sudamir had somehow managed to survive the Angel's wrath by protecting the core of the mansion through particularly powerful wards. The surviving Ibasans hurriedly gathered around the ruin, after which Sudamir translocated it out of the city. Annoyingly, Zorian had no option but to let it go. He was too busy to chase after them, his most powerful allies were incapacitated, and the other city defenders couldn't get through the gathered Ibasan forces fast enough. He would later find out that Sudamir translocated his mansion 2 more times after that, eventually landing on Ulquin Ibasa, where he was granted refuge by the natives. Great. If Eldamar had any doubts as to who to blame for the attack, they were unambiguously sure now. Not that Quatakikal, the instigator of the attack, cared about that. If Zorian had learned anything from Jornak's mind, it was that Quatakikal was likely quite happy with this outcome. Kiriel and Kana were alive and well despite the attack on them. Zorian breathed a big sigh of relief when he found that out. Sadly, Kistjenka joined Merva in the Hall of Heroic Golems by sacrificing herself to save his little sister. An event that caused many tears on Kiriel's part and prompted Zorian to consider if he should perhaps delete her memories of the whole incident and quietly replace Kistjenka's remains with an unharmed copy. But no, that was a bad idea. He shouldn't be that casual with memory wipes. And besides, Kiriel didn't know anything about golem theory, so she shouldn't see anything wrong with Zorian fixing Kistjenka into pristine condition. Overall, things had turned out great. He had to give away the Imperial Orb to get rid of Oganj. Quatakikal and Sudamir were still alive and would probably make moves against them in the future, and there was a high chance of another continental war brewing in the near future, but it could have been worse. His friends and family were all alive, Zack was alive, and he was alive. The only thing that kind of worried him was that he found Silver Lake's empty skin back where he left her fighting with her original self. It was clear that the spider not just killed her but ate her as well. Which was strange. Grey hunters primarily ate powerful magical creatures. To his knowledge, they thought humans tasted vile. The flesh wasn't magical enough for their tastes. Why was Silver Lake eaten then? Was it because of all the primordial essence Silver Lake's body contained? There was no trace of the Grey Hunter anywhere in the city, and Zorian had pretty much total coverage of everything on the surface at the moment. He had a sinking feeling the spider had fled into the local underground, which meant he had just let an immensely powerful magical predator, one that had recently gorged upon a great amount of primordial essence, no less, escape into the one place where there was absolutely no hope of tracking it down. He sighed. There was no use in worrying about this now. The deadline had come and passed. Zack's contract with the Angels had harmlessly dissolved, and Jornak's death pact claimed his life in a gruesome fashion, his own flesh turning against itself like a country in the throes of a civil war. Observing with his more magical senses, Zorian noticed that even the man's mind and soul were seemingly tearing themselves apart. After a few seconds of disgusting writhing and convulsing, Jornak simply collapsed in a pile of unsightly goo. Zorian opened his eyes, letting the spell finally collapse. He breathed a sigh of relief. He was beyond exhausted. He and his simulacrums had maintained a fake illusionary world. Two of them, actually, and had done that for more than a day without rest or sleep. He was no longer alone, however. He had moved to a secluded, secure space with Zack and Jornak in tow, but it wasn't really secret to Daimen, Svim, and Alanik. All three were currently watching him with grave, vaguely unfriendly expressions. Svim was sitting on a nearby chair, a small book in his hand. Alanik was standing in the center of the room, his hands folded over his chest. And Daimen was leaning against the nearby doorway, blocking the exit and juggling the imperial dagger that Zorian had removed from Jornak's possessions. All three were also clutching memory crystals in one of their hands. Zorian doubted they had absorbed more than a small fraction of the memories stored in them, but they probably knew enough to understand the general situation. "We need to talk," Alanik said blandly. Rather than answering, Zorian ripped out a paper from a nearby notebook and started furiously writing on it while explaining the situation to all three of them. A whole bunch of Jornak's contingencies were about to activate relatively soon, and they had to be dealt with as soon as possible. His rushed scribblings were meant to be a reminder if they forgot some of the details he was telling them. The three people in front of him seemed to be part annoyed and part curious about his rushed explanation, but they were polite enough to stay silent and listen while he was talking. It didn't take long anyway. Only a handful of Jornak's plans were so very time-critical. His list of instructions done, Zorian stumbled to his feet, his limbs not working properly due to the long period of disuse, and thrust the written list straight into Alanik's confused hands before falling to the floor unconscious. He was Zorian Kaczynski, third son of a minor merchant family from Siren, accidental time traveler, and quite possibly the most powerful human mind mage in all of Altazia. And he had won. And now it was time to finally get some rest. The book. Zorian's eyes abruptly shot open as a sharp pain erupted from his stomach. His whole body convulsed, buckling against the object that fell on him, and suddenly he was wide awake, not a trace of drowsiness in his mind. "Good morning, brother." An annoyingly cheerful voice sounded right on top of him. "Morning, morning, morning." Panic. Zorian's awakened mind felt nothing but pure, all-consuming terror. After all of his efforts, all the sacrifices he and people around him had made, it was all for naught. He was back where it all began, in his room in Siren, about to start his third year at the academy. Then the moment passed and the nightmare dissolved. The room around him was wrong. This wasn't his room back in Siren. He was in Cyoria, in the room he shared with Kiriel at Amaya's place. And the little devil was currently still sprawled across his stomach, kicking her legs up in the air and giving him a mischievous, expectant look. His panicked reaction didn't seem to worry her. If anything, she seemed quite pleased with herself for managing to scare him so thoroughly. "Kiriel, why?" Zorian asked, resisting the urge to sigh. "What do you mean?" she asked innocently. "I always wake you up like this?" "Not with those exact words, you don't," Zorian groused. "He put you up to this, didn't he?" "Zack said it was going to be funnier this way," Kiriel admitted, propping her chin with her hands. She gave him a toothy smile. Zorian flipped her over the edge of the bed in response, causing her to fall to the floor with a silent thud. The little imp had expected the reaction and made no sound in response, simply scrambling to her feet immediately afterwards. "It's been a month already," Zorian grumbled. "Just when is he planning to stop with this petty revenge crap?" It wasn't like Zorian had wanted to deceive him like that. He'd done that to save Zack's life, for heaven's sake. Well, at least he hadn't gotten another punch in the face for that. He chased Kiriel out of the room and got dressed, idly listening to the sounds of the house and its tenants as he did. Amaya's place was very busy these days, nothing like the quiet household Zorian had gotten used to during the time loop. The academy dorms had suffered heavy damage during the invasion, both in the initial artillery bombardment and the fighting that had followed afterwards, which meant that a lot of students were suddenly homeless and in dire need of alternate accommodations. Since Amaya's house had survived the invasion mostly intact, it was soon filled to capacity and even slightly beyond. Zorian didn't really like it, but the situation was what it was, and there was nothing he could do to change it. At least Kiriel had plenty of people to talk to these days. After composing himself a little, he left the room and entered the kitchen, where a dozen or so people had already gathered, some of them still eating breakfast, and some of them pondering a stack of textbooks and papers arranged around them. Most of the people gathered here were his classmates. Akoja, Rainy, Kiana, Capriva, Kale, Naeem, Edwin, and Eston were all gathered around the small table that was far too small to really accommodate them all. They immediately stopped what they were doing and turned to look at him as he entered, calling out greetings. Ilsa, who was sitting at a relatively prominent place at the table, was flipping through a stack of papers on her clipboard, and simply gave him a curt nod before returning to her task. Nachka, Kiriel, and Kana were on the floor, playing with dolls and getting into everyone's way from time to time. Zorian had no idea why they felt the need to play their games here instead of somewhere more private, but nobody else was shooing them away, so he wouldn't do it either. As for Amaya, the landlord of this place, she was working around the kitchen while humming a happy tune to herself, looking like she was having the time of her life, despite the current overcrowded state of her home. Zorian knew she was getting paid for this, but he still couldn't quite understand her good mood. Some people were just weird. After a few seconds of looking around, Zorian suddenly realized there were no free chairs left anymore. "This is what happens when you wake up late," Capriva helpfully explained to him. "There should be some free chairs in the next room," Amaya added, stirring the contents of some giant pot, not even bothering to turn around and look at him. "You should probably grab a nightstand or a wooden board or something, just so you have a surface to write on," Edwin told him. "The table is a little crowded right now." Resisting a sigh, Zorian went about securing himself a chair and then carving out a place for himself at the table. This took a considerable amount of pushing and arguing, but eventually he managed to squeeze himself between Kale and Naeem. Amaya immediately plopped down a plate of food in front of him and immediately walked away, not giving Zorian a chance to tell her he wasn't hungry. "You really need to learn how to be more assertive in life," Naeem advised from his left. Zorian raised his eyebrow at him. "Weren't you the one who just tried to chase me away from your side of the table?" Zorian asked. "Well, yeah, you need to be more assertive towards others, not me," Naeem responded, laughing slightly. "Whatever. Where is Zach?" Zorian asked. "Your friend already left," Ilsa said, glancing up from her clipboard for a moment. "He said he had a court meeting scheduled soon and couldn't wait for you to wake up." "He said you already know how to contact him," Kale added. Zorian nodded slowly, giving the food in front of him a tentative bite. After their victory over Jornak and the invasion, Zach had wasted no time in filing a lawsuit against his caretaker. Zorian had advised him back then to wait a little for the circumstances to calm down a little, but Zach would have none of it. This decision had both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, the spotlight was still firmly focused on the failed invasion of the city, meaning Tezen was free to try and shut the whole thing down without too much outcry from the public. On the other hand, this was probably the worst time for Tezen to be accused of something like this, considering the royals were looking for someone to publicly make an example out of, due to the debacle that had happened and all. Zorian mostly stayed out of the whole thing. He trusted Zach to know what he was doing. He claimed he didn't need any help with this, and he had clearly been prepared for this a long time. "Aren't you worried at least a little?" Akoja said, frowning. "I mean, Tezen is a powerful man and he surely knows you and Zach are friends. What if he decides to get back at him by going after you?" Zorian smiled slightly. He found it interesting how pretty much none of their classmates thought Zach was lying about his accusations. He had expected that at least some of them would have thought Zach was making things up. But even Akoja, who definitely wasn't a fan of Zach, absolutely believed him when he publicly stated Tezen had robbed him of his family legacy. "I'm not worried," Zorian said. "This is the worst time to try and attack people in Cyoria. The whole city is crawling with soldiers and investigators. Tezen would have to be mad to go after me right now." This was not entirely true, of course. Tezen had already tried to send people to scout Amaya's house and see if they could ambush him when he left the place. But these people had simply vanished into thin air before their mission was done. After that, Zach's caretaker hadn't bothered sending anyone else. "Indeed," Ilsa said. "Plus, I had the academy secure this house with additional wards, since we are effectively using it as a makeshift classroom." Anyone trying to infiltrate the place is in for an unpleasant surprise. And with that, I propose we start our usual lesson now. As you can imagine, an alteration expert like me is in high demand during this time of reconstruction, so I can only spare so much time here. Everyone immediately gave their assent for the idea, some more enthusiastically than others, after which Ilsa started giving short demonstrations to the gathered students. Even Kiriel, Nochka, and Kana paid close attention when Ilsa was casting spells, not having many opportunities to witness magic spells like this in their daily lives. The academy was temporarily closed. It had been closed for a month now, ever since the failed invasion. Not only had many sections of the academy been damaged in the attack, but most of the teachers had been recruited by the city to help deal with the aftermath as well. The place was scheduled to reopen in a week or so, if only to stop angry parents from demanding the money they had paid for attendance fees back. But for now, the student body was told to simply wait. A large number of students did just that, treating the whole thing as a sort of vacation. But not everyone was willing to simply waste a whole month or more when they had already paid to learn how to do magic. These students self-organized into study groups and continued their education on their own. Zorian was one of the people leading the charge on such things, at least when it came to his own class. He knew there were at least a handful of people in there that were serious about becoming a proper mage, and finding a study group that was not just an excuse to play cards every other night or some egoist's attempt to gather underlings was bound to be hard. This sort of initiative was admittedly not something Zorian was used to, and he had been absent from classes for most of the previous month, so his announcement that he was starting a study group had definitely raised some eyebrows. However, the fact that he had managed to talk Ilsa and some of the other teachers into occasionally giving demonstrations and lectures, something few others could boast about, made others more willing to trust him. The fact Akoja had decided to give up on her own study group in favor of choosing his own probably helped too. Akoja was well known for her serious attitude and work ethic. If she was willing to join Zorian's group, he probably wasn't just messing around. He even got quite a few requests from older students and students from other classes about joining the group, though Zorian had to refuse most of them due to time constraints. He didn't want to spend most of his time teaching people and managing groups. It just wasn't something he was seriously interested in. "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong with this spell," Kale complained. Zorian glanced at the Morlock and at the open book where the spell was detailed. "You're not doing anything wrong," Zorian told him. "You're casting the spell perfectly. Your shaping skills simply aren't good enough to pull it off. I can show you some more shaping exercises if you want." "Great," Kale mumbled. "More shaping exercises. You really remind me of that Svim guy you occasionally bring here to teach us." "That guy is his mentor, so it kinda makes sense," Capriva said. "Based on what I heard about the guy, you kinda have to go all the way with your shaping skills if you're assigned to him." "As if Zorian is suffering here," Edwin grumbled. He was, like Zorian, one of the people who had been assigned to Svim against his will, and still hadn't gotten over it. Probably because he really only cared about magic if it could help him with golem making, and shaping skills weren't high on the list of requisites for that. He's probably the only guy in the history of our academy that likes the guy and what he's teaching. You'd be surprised to know how many people speak highly of Mr. Chow's teaching skills, Ilsa remarked with a teasing smile. Though most people don't appreciate his genius, there are always one or two students that have what it takes to thrive under his tutelage. He didn't keep his job at the academy all these years for nothing, you know? We understand he's good at what he does, but does he really have to be so mean about it? Kiana said, pouting. The last time he was here he said my shaping skills are completely inadequate. I'm pretty sure my shaping skills are average at worst. Actually, they're very much above average now, and it's almost entirely due to Svim pushing you further and further every time he comes here, Zorian pointed out. Teacher's pet, Kiana accused him with a huff. He was pretty sure Kiana was coming here only because Rainy was too, not because she was honestly so dedicated to improving her magic skills. But to her credit, she really did try to keep up with the rest of the group, unwilling to be left behind. Thus, whenever Svim criticized her and pushed her to try for more, she reluctantly did her best to rise to the challenge. She didn't appreciate it right now, but Zorian was sure she would eventually understand that Svim was doing her a huge favor. Most people had to pay a fortune to get personal instructions from an archmage. After a while, Ilsa excused herself and left. The group continued interacting and helping each other for a while after that, but eventually people started leaving and the group was becoming smaller. The table, so crowded and busy earlier in the morning, started to clear up and fall silent. In the end, the only ones left sitting there were Zorian and Rainy. Zorian had originally wanted to leave as well, but he could see from the glances Rainy was sending him and the emotions radiating off of her that she wanted to talk to him, so he remained patient and stayed in his seat. The invasion had been thwarted. Panic-Seth remained sealed. There was no more urgent danger constantly occupying his attention. He could finally waste an hour or two of his life and not feel bad about it in the back of his head. I just realized it's been a whole month and I never thanked you for helping me find my little brother, Rainy eventually said, her tone hesitant. Zorian didn't know what to say to that. Since she hadn't mentioned any of this in all this time, he kind of figured she wanted to pretend the whole thing never happened. Sorry, she said, fiddling with her hands awkwardly. I know this is very late and dash. I don't hold it against you, Zorian assured her. I didn't do much really. I just put you in contact with the right people. You did the rest by organizing the other shifters into a rescue mission. You already heard about that? She asked, surprised. Then she shook her head. Wait, of course you heard about that, what am I even saying? After what I've seen that evening, it would be a bigger surprise if you didn't know anything about what happened. I hear you rescued your brother successfully, Zorian remarked. The cat shifters and pigeon shifters rescued my brother successfully, she corrected him. I just helped the police contact them and talk them into helping me. Then I just stood by the side and waited to see if they would succeed. Though yes, the newspapers have been crediting me for the whole thing. The city police insisted I should be the public face of the whole operation. I don't really understand it. What was there to understand? She was a beautiful teenage girl with an emotional story of trying to save her little brother. The police probably didn't want to release details about what was really going on before Eldamar's forces finished their investigation, and this was a nice way of distracting the public. Plus, it was a story with a happy ending and Eldamar really loved pushing those to the forefront right now. He didn't say that out loud, of course. I'm pretty sure talking those two groups of shifters into cooperating wasn't easy at all. So don't put yourself down so much, Zorian told her. That aside, I get the feeling you're not really mentioning this because you're bothered by the newspaper exposure. What's got you so depressed? I'm not depressed, it's just, my family has invited me to come back home, she admitted with a sigh. Ah, Zorian nodded. He paused for a second, considering. Is this a problem? You were instrumental in saving your younger brother, no? They should give you a hero's welcome. They might, she admitted. Or maybe they'll accuse me of overstepping my boundaries when I promised our tribes help in exchange for help in the rescue mission. I really don't know what's going to happen when I get there and it scares me. Zorian was silent. I don't know why I'm telling you this, she admitted after a while. It's not like I expect you to help. You've done more than enough already. I guess I just wanted to complain to someone other than Kiana for a change. She's getting a little annoyed with me lately, I think. She thinks being praised in the newspapers is great and that I'm being a baby. The newspapers are using you as a distraction and would turn on you in a second if it suited their purposes. So it's good you're not letting it get to your head, Zorian remarked. Still, I don't think you need to worry. I bet your family also doesn't know what's going to happen when you get there. They probably just want to see where they stand with you since you surprised them so badly. Further conversation was interrupted by a large buzzing sound from a stone disc tied around Zorian's waist. Zorian glanced at it, somewhat annoyed. It was a communication device House Aope had given him so they could contact him, though Zorian hardly thought it deserved to be called a device. It was just a stone that vibrated when told to buy a second stone the Aope were in possession of, and did nothing else. Rather than convey useful information, the stone disc merely told him that House Aope representatives wanted to see him as soon as possible. He badly wanted to make real communication stones for this kind of use. Something small and discreet and capable of facilitating actual two-way telepathy between holders. But doing that would be extremely suspicious and attention-grabbing. I'm going to have to cut this meeting short, he told Rainy. The Arania? Rainy guessed. Zorian nodded. I still can't believe that's what you've been doing this past month. You've been absent from classes, Rainy said. Learning mind magic from giant underground spiders. There was no other way, Zorian said. My empathy was running out of control and they were the first ones to realize what was happening and stepped up to help me. I'm really grateful for their help. Sadly, although Zack and Zorian had been successful in keeping their involvement in the invasion itself a secret, There was no way to keep Zorian's involvement with the Arania a secret. This was because the Cyorrian web had no way of hiding itself from Eldamar's authorities in the wake of the invasion, and asked Zorian to help them broker some kind of agreement with the city authorities. A hard task, and one that had given Zorian many headaches during this past month, but thankfully they had the support of noble House Aope in this endeavor. It would have probably been an impossible task, otherwise. Zorian might be a mastermind mage, but there was no way he could compel the entire royal bureaucracy to acknowledge a group of scary telepathic spiders as an ally against their will. Nor would he want to be that forceful even if it were within his power. Sadly, this also meant that knowledge of Zorian's innate mind magic was gradually becoming more common. People thought he was a complete beginner at mind magic, yes, but he had already noticed mages starting to raise their mental shields when he was around, and his empathy told him some people were scared of him on sight. He dreaded to think what would happen if the full extent of his abilities became known. "Well," said Rainy, "don't let me keep you from your duties. I should really get going as well. I guess I won't be seeing you in our group meetings then?" Zorian guessed. "Yes, that was the other thing I wanted to tell you. I knew I was forgetting something," Rainy said. "I'll be traveling home tomorrow and I will probably stay there until the academy reopens." "We'll see each other in class then," Zorian said. "Hopefully," she agreed. The two of them then each left their own way and the kitchen was once again empty and quiet. But not for long. Things were always lively at Amaya's place these days. Though it was awful to even think so, Akoja had to say that this invasion business was the best thing that had happened to her in quite a while. She always felt guilty whenever the thought occurred to her. So many people had died, lost their homes or lost their jobs when their workshops got destroyed. She should really feel sorry for them. And she did. She really did. But it was also an undeniable fact that the immediate aftermath had breathed new purpose into her life, giving her both the clarity about what she wanted in life and opportunities for advancements that she would have otherwise missed. In the month leading up to the attack of the city, she was lost and more than a little bitter. She was putting so much work into her studies, into being a class representative and a model student, yet she felt it was all for naught. 2 years of hard work had not given her any special position or advanced opportunities. It only made other students resent her and look down on her. Sometimes, when she sat alone in her dorm room, she couldn't help but wonder if she was just wasting her time. Then the attack happened and it was terrifying. She had only seen a fraction of the fighting, but what she had seen made her feel like a powerless ant, completely at the mercy of greater forces that could sweep her up without really trying. When the dust had settled and Akoja looked at the shattered remains of her old dorm, all of her belongings destroyed, she did not feel anger or despair at the money she had lost or the time and effort she would have to spend to replace it all. Instead, she felt a fire ignite within her, urging her to throw herself into her studies and make sure this kind of thing couldn't happen ever again. When war came for her again, she wanted to be ready. And war was definitely coming. Everyone knew it. Akoja wasn't the most avid follower of news, but she had read enough newspaper articles and listened to enough rumors to know that Eldamar was definitely going to launch a punitive expedition at Ulquinabesa in the coming months. Even though it risked leaving Eldamar vulnerable to opportunistic attacks by Fokrinia and Sulamnon, pride wouldn't allow Eldamar to swallow its anger and let this go. The only thing people were unsure of was how big the retaliation would really be, and how far Eldamar was willing to go to avenge Cyorria. In any case, if Akoja had been on her own, perhaps her newfound drive would have eventually petered out in the coming weeks, and she would have once again begun questioning herself. A lot of people were fleeing the city these days, especially students like her and workers who otherwise lived elsewhere and only came to Cyorria to make money. A couple of other girls from Corsa she occasionally talked to had already transferred themselves to other academies elsewhere in the kingdom, their parents having been spooked by the attack and fearful another one would follow in the wake of the first. It was, after all, still unclear how Ulquinabesa had been able to strike so deep into Eldamar territory, so who was to say it couldn't happen again? Akoja's parents had also wanted to transfer her elsewhere, but she had refused. Cyorria may be dangerous, but she had to stay. Because Zorian was here. It wasn't just because she had a crush on him either. She talked to people and it was obvious that the study group he had organized was the best one currently out there. He had teachers and even outside mages occasionally coming to provide lessons, which only one other study group had managed to do, and he himself was clearly very skilled for his age. He had an uncanny ability to notice the problems people were having and how to fix them. Akoja had compared her progress during this past month with two other girls that had paid considerable money in order to be allowed in one of the better study groups, and was shocked to realize she was handily beating them. The comparison wasn't even close. She didn't know what to think about that. One of the things she really liked about Zorian was that he was like her, a regular guy from a commoner family that tried really hard and was serious about his studies. She had always been jealous of big-name students who came from noble families, or had secret magic and bloodlines that gave them an edge over the competition, so it was refreshing to see someone she could empathize with. Even though he could be a little unfriendly and tactless, she understood. She herself was often described as bitchy and joyless, so they had common ground there. But this new Zorian made her question if she really knew the guy. He was more skilled and well-connected than she imagined him to be, and apparently even had innate mind magic ability to draw upon. So unfair. Why didn't she have a famous older brother and a secret bloodline? How was a normal girl like her even supposed to compete with that? But she eventually decided it didn't matter. Maybe her reasons for liking him were kind of misguided, but she still liked him regardless. And he was helping her get better. So she had to stay in the city. It would have been better if she hadn't stated it quite like that in the letter she had sent to her parents, though, because now they wanted to meet him. She knew her father. He was definitely going to come over to Cyoria and confront Zorian on his own if she didn't manage to defuse the situation. Hopefully her last letter had reached them in time. Still, that was thankfully a concern for another day. Today she was simply going shopping around the city with Capriva and Kale. All of her possessions had gotten destroyed in the invasion after all, and she still hadn't had the chance to fully replenish them. Capriva was in a similar position to her, while Kale had apparently never had much stuff to begin with, as he had previously tended to constantly move around with Kana before coming to Cyoria, meaning until recently he owned very few things. Neither Capriva nor Kale was someone that Akoja would have wanted to associate with before the attack. Capriva came from a family of criminals and Kale was a Morlock. Neither were people that a lady in good standing such as her would want to be seen with. However, strange times made for strange bedfellows. She had gotten to know these two over the past month and they were all right, she supposed. Wait, so Zack bought you an entire lab? Capriva asked incredulously, looking at Kale. Well, a damaged, recently abandoned building that can be repurposed into a lab. But yes, Kale nodded happily. Now I can finally stop scaring Miss Kuroshka with the experiments I do in her basement. Honestly, you were scaring me and the other tenants as well, Capriva told him. Alchemy experiments shouldn't be done right below where other people are sleeping, even if the place is warded. Still, I'm surprised Zack was willing to shell out that kind of money for you. Even if it's been damaged in the attack, a building in Cyoria is still bound to be expensive as hell. A lot of people are selling property in Cyoria these days, Kale noted. Prices have dropped considerably. I'm pretty sure it was Zorian who talked Zack into spending money on this, Akoja said, sighing internally. He didn't like Zack. His recent reveal that his caretaker was stealing from him made Akoja feel sorry for him a little. But only a little. He was the embodiment of everything she was jealous of when it came to Eldamar's Mage Elite. Except he didn't even try to make something of himself, content to live the life of a clown and a wastrel. She hoped Zorian, as his new friend, would help him clean up his act, but she wasn't holding her breath. Probably, Kale agreed. I was surprised when people told me they only became friends over the summer holidays. They seem like they have been friends their whole lives. Yeah, I first thought Zorian was just taking advantage of Zack to get at his money, but these days I kind of doubt it, Capriva said. He has a serious source of cash of his own, I can tell. From what? Akoja asked curiously. How could a teenager like Zorian have serious money, unless someone gifted it to him? Sales, Capriva said. I don't know what he's selling, but it must be pretty rare and profitable because people have been asking about him a lot, trying to get in contact with him. You mean, in your circles? Akoja asked worriedly. It would have been better if she hadn't stated it quite like that in the letter she had sent to her parents, though, because now they wanted to meet him. She knew her father. He was definitely going to come over to Cyoria and confront Zorian on his own if she didn't manage to defuse the situation. Hopefully her last letter had reached them in time. Still, that was thankfully a concern for another day. Today she was simply going shopping around the city with Capriva and Kale. All of her possessions had gotten destroyed in the invasion after all, and she still hadn't had the chance to fully replenish them. Capriva was in a similar position to her, while Kale had apparently never had much stuff to begin with, as he had previously tended to constantly move around with Kana before coming to Cyoria, meaning until recently he owned very few things. Neither Capriva nor Kale was someone that Akoja would have wanted to associate with before the attack. Capriva came from a family of criminals and Kale was a Morlock. Neither were people that a lady in good standing such as her would want to be seen with. However, strange times made for strange bedfellows. She had gotten to know these two over the past month and they were all right, she supposed. Wait, so Zack bought you an entire lab? Capriva asked incredulously, looking at Kale. Well, a damaged, recently abandoned building that can be repurposed into a lab. But yes, Kale nodded happily. Now I can finally stop scaring Miss Kuroshka with the experiments I do in her basement. Honestly, you were scaring me and the other tenants as well, Capriva told him. Alchemy experiments shouldn't be done right below where other people are sleeping, even if the place is warded. Still, I'm surprised Zack was willing to shell out that kind of money for you. Even if it's been damaged in the attack, a building in Cyoria is still bound to be expensive as hell. A lot of people are selling property in Cyoria these days, Kale noted. Prices have dropped considerably. I'm pretty sure it was Zorian who talked Zack into spending money on this, Akoja said, sighing internally. He didn't like Zack. His recent reveal that his caretaker was stealing from him made Akoja feel sorry for him a little. But only a little. He was the embodiment of everything she was jealous of when it came to Eldamar's mage elite. Except he didn't even try to make something of himself, content to live the life of a clown and a wastrel. She hoped Zorian, as his new friend, would help him clean up his act, but she wasn't holding her breath. Probably, Kale agreed. I was surprised when people told me they only became friends over the summer holidays. They seem like they have been friends their whole lives. Yeah, I first thought Zorian was just taking advantage of Zack to get at his money, but these days I kind of doubt it, Capriva said. He has a serious source of cash of his own, I can tell. From what? Akoja asked curiously. How could a teenager like Zorian have serious money, unless someone gifted it to him? Sales, Capriva said. I don't know what he's selling, but it must be pretty rare and profitable because people have been asking about him a lot, trying to get in contact with him. You mean, in your circles? Akoja asked worriedly. Elior Inid was the special investigator sent by the Crown of Eldamar to find out what exactly had happened in Cyoria on the day of the attack. And he was not happy. Not happy at all. It wasn't just about a foreign power having the ability to strike deep into Eldamar's territory at their leisure. It wasn't just about the rampant betrayal among Eldamar's highest ranks that had allowed this attack to progress as far as it had. It was about the fact that someone had stopped the invasion and saved the city, and it wasn't anyone that Elior recognized. Regular people often talked about mysterious organizations and enigmatic hermits moving about in the shadows of polite society, but the truth was that organizations that held real power and powerful individuals didn't spring out of nowhere. It took a lot of resources and connections to raise a top-tier mage, and even more to build an organization around one. By the time these rising powers were able and willing to exert their will and influence on the world around them, people like Elior will have already noticed them and learned who they were. When mysterious events like the one that had happened a month ago in Cyoria occurred, investigators were often unsure who exactly was behind them, especially if the perpetrators had been thorough and erased all the evidence. However, they always had an idea who could have done it, even if they had no proof or couldn't narrow down all the possibilities to one actor. At the moment, though, Elior had plenty of evidence. He had witness testimonials, magical recordings, field reports from soldiers and mages that had been present when the attack took place, and even material evidence. And all of it was telling him that this couldn't have been done by anyone he knew about. Even more disturbingly, even after he had consulted with some of his foreign sources, he was no closer to finding a likely candidate. No one had any idea who could have done this. It was as if these saviors had materialized straight out of thin air, and vanished just as suddenly afterwards. Elior stood in front of the wreckage of a large golem, hands folded behind his back. To his left, two researchers shuffled uncomfortably in place, hesitating to speak. Well? He asked them impatiently. Have you identified the maker of this thing? None of the known golem makers produced this, Mr. Inid, one of the researchers said after fumbling with his clothes a little and clearing his throat. Although the animation core has been shattered beyond recovery, enough of it survived that we have been able to make some startling discoveries. We are very sure the established golem makers would never make such a thing. Why is that? Eliur asked, suddenly curious. Honestly, he thought the golem wreckage would bring him no answers, so this was a pleasant surprise. The spell formulas inscribed on the animation core are completely unprotected, the other researcher said. No codes, no misdirection, no attempts to shroud the method of creation at all. Usually artificers spend almost as much time trying to hide how they made something as they do making designs for it. Golem makers especially so. But there is no evidence of that here. Whoever made this thing cared only about pure efficiency. Are you saying we could potentially replicate this thing? Eliur asked. Now wouldn't that be something? He had heard reports about how good these golems were, and it was apparently something on a whole different level from your typical combat golem. If they could duplicate one of these, then this would be a huge gain. When Eliur saw the two researchers share a knowing look with each other, however, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The issue is that the animation core has been totally shattered, and some parts of the spell formula inscribed on it are missing. Even after we compared it with the remains of other golem wrecks we have recovered from the city, we are still missing about 10% of the design. Just 10%? And you can't fill in the blanks? Eliur asked curiously. Heavens no, the first researcher said, bursting into laughter. The design for this thing is one of the most complex things I've ever seen in my life. Everything slots together perfectly, and even the slightest mistake would make everything collapse on itself. And considering how expensive the materials for the construction of this kind of core are, experimentation would be hellishly expensive. Never mind 10%, even a 1% gap would make this design completely unviable. Unless we manage to find an intact golem, the only thing this is useful for is for serving as inspiration. All right, Eliur said, turning away from the wreckage and walking off. The two researchers quickly followed after him. What is this about some mysterious books that I'm hearing about? Ah, you mean the mysterious gifts some people have been getting? The second researcher asked. Eliur nodded. We have only managed to recover a handful of them from the people they were given to. Rumors of us confiscating them have spread among people fast, as has the fact they are of no danger to the recipient, so people no longer report them to us. But from the few we have in our hands, they seem to be full of novel magic specifically tailored for the recipient. If I may make a suggestion, it might be prudent to return the books we've confiscated to the people they were given to, the first researcher said. We've already copied the contents, and it might motivate people to let us take a look at the stuff they're currently hiding if they see they're eventually going to get it back. I'll think about it, Eliur said, not thinking much of it. He didn't like the idea of someone handing over magical secrets to people like that, not at all. Plus, he had suspicions their mysterious saviors were behind this as well. Those gifts were evidence, and he was keeping them at least so long as his investigation lasted. Infuriatingly, said investigation was encountering a lot of unexpected obstacles. The Triumvirate Church had clearly been heavily involved in the battle. There was a giant angel battling a dragon mage in the skies of Cyoria, for heaven's sake. But they refused to let him interrogate the priesthood involved, and the crown was reluctant to offend them. The church had been spectacularly successful recently, providing valuable help and information on necromancer hideouts, demon summoner bases, and some of the more awful criminal groups. Eliur had no idea how they had gotten so much critical information about Eldamar's criminal underbelly, but they had, and this unfortunately meant they currently had an upper hand over him and his investigation.